Hey, this is TD Desso.
And I'm Ron Rucker.
And we're the host of the Connecting Theology podcast, broadcasting live each week on Saturdays at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time from Fishbowl Studios.
We are here to help you navigate two huge questions. What's going on in the world and how is it connected to God? Be ready to be challenged.
Be sure to log on each week on Saturdays at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time to catch the Connecting Theology podcast. Jump in.
Everybody, welcome to the Connecting Theology podcast brought to you from Fishbowl Studios. We are so glad that you have joined us today for our podcast. Today's episode is titled The Decline in Theological Education. We're going to jump into this subject with a written and awesome scholar, Dr. Craig Mitchell. Thank you for being here, Dr. Mitchell, and to our audience, thank you for watching. Dr. Rucker is going to share with us a little about our guest, and then we'll jump right into our discussion today.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Pastor Desso, my good friend. Today, as Pastor Desso stated, we have Craig Mitchell with us, and I had the pleasure, I guess the honor of having Dr. Mitchell as a professor at seminary. And I have to tell you before I read his bio that there is none better than Dr. Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mitchell is the caliber of individual or godly man who he can step into any arena out there, and if you give him a little bit of time, he'll probably be the most knowledgeable person in that arena. He is one of extremely high intellect, and he is probably the only professor that I have ever had that comes to the classroom who just brings his jacket and himself.
And you told me about that. What's on his jacket?
Oh, yeah, the Raiders.
Okay.
And he lectures with zero notes, and his lectures are very informative, and you can tell that he knows his subject.
Mm-hmm.
And with that said, let me introduce Dr. Mitchell to our audience. Dr. Mitchell is a PhD. He is a Christian ethicist, economist, and engineer. He is also an independent scholar who has completed 7 degrees. His area of focus is Christian worldview. He is author of a number of books and many articles. He was associate professor of philosophy, politics, and economics at Criswell College here in Dallas, Texas. He was also an associate professor of Christian ethics at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. And in addition to all of that, he has taught adjunctly at a number of schools throughout the country. And that's Dr. Mitchell.
Okay, awesome.
Yes, sir.
Well, Dr. Mitchell, again, so glad to have you. So the discussion today is on, quite honestly, something that a lot of people have recognized already, that something's going on in theological education. There is a decline in enrollment across, or in seminaries across the United States. We want to jump into that and pick your brain, Dr. Mitchell, of possible reasons why. First of all, which one do you think is struggling more, the conservative school or the more liberal school? For example, on the conservative side, you have schools like Liberty or Southwestern. And on the more liberal side, you have institutions like Vanderbilt or Union Theological, which are completely, different ends of the spectrum. in your view, which one is struggling more, the conservative school or the more liberal school?
Well, I have to admit that's something I haven't looked at at any level of depth myself. I suspect that the more conservative schools are probably struggling more for the very simple reason that when you look at a lot of your more liberal schools, they are attached to universities that have endowments, and so they're not as in danger of going away, whereas your more conservative schools are independent or they're funded by a denomination which probably doesn't fund them at the levels that they need to be. And at the same time, when you look at the Southern Baptist seminaries, and there are 6 of those, right now they teach 1/3 of all people studying theology these days. Now that's down from 1/2. When I was teaching at Southwestern, I left in 2014. It was easily half the number of students being taught theology were being taught at Southern Baptist seminaries, and now we're down to 1/3. So,
okay,
so it's a little hard to answer your question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the answer that you gave is very insightful, and I think it reinforces the influence that the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, has had on American Christianity. Would you say that the Southern Baptist Convention, not just with its schools, but just in general, would you say that the SBC is losing its influence on American Christianity today?
I wouldn't say that it's losing its influence on American Christianity, but I think American Christianity is in decline in general. And so I think it might be easy to confuse the two, but there's still very large number of Southern Baptists, and as I said, 1/3 of all seminary students or divinity students are going to a Southern Baptist school.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, we're talking about, and I'm kind of slow to bring up this this question, because it is a hot button topic right now, and but just quite bluntly, we are all aware of the protests that is going on many college campuses, and connecting that with the decline in theological or formal theological education. What are your thoughts concerning the recent protests on college campuses over the war in Israel? Particularly, do you see, or do you think there's a connection between that issue and those protests and the decline in formal theological education?
Well, yes, I think that a lot of this protest is due to the fact that colleges and universities have drifted, and our culture has drifted. When you start to look at what a lot of young people are saying and thinking these days, they want to blame the Jews, they want to blame Israelis for all of the stuff that's happening, and you have a higher percentage of young people these days who don't either know or believe that the Holocaust actually happened. When I was growing up, I mean, that was just a given. Everybody knew about it. And today, I think there is a rise. In fact, I know that there's a rise in anti-Semitism across university campuses in general. And what this says to me is that there's a much larger problem than what's going on in our universities. It's something reflective of what's going on in our culture in general. And I think that's reflected also in the decrease of the influence of Christianity in our culture. You know, Francis Schaeffer said years ago, in the 70s, that America was a post-Christian nation. Well, there may have been some doubt about that then, but there's no doubt about it now.
Okay, so you think it's a cultural thing. So you I'm guessing you would not limit it just to the church.
Right.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Yes,
No.
I think one of the reasons that a lot of this is happening is you have a lot of uninformed young people who are being fed a load of hooey at a lot of these universities, and sadly they weren't taught well about the history of Europe, what happened in World War II. They weren't. It's just amazing how much they don't know, and I think some of them are looking to be attached to something that they perceive to have some meaning, and so they join in on these protests, not really understanding what's going on.
Okay, so it seems that you're saying that there was a decline in education, period. Would that be?
Oh, definitely.
Okay, now, and I would agree with that, but there are disciplines like business, for example, and technology. There are some disciplines wherein there is growth in enrollment. Particularly, why is the discipline of religious studies or theological studies, why is it in decline a little more than other disciplines?
So this is reflective of a problem that you see in the humanities in general. Mm-hmm. You know, when I graduated with my first degree, that was 1980, and things for the first time were starting to change with higher education. Because before then, if you got a degree, it didn't matter what in. You were guaranteed to find a job, and you were guaranteed to be better off. When I graduated in 1980, I graduated with a BS in electronics engineering, technology, and mathematics, and I found a job right away. And what was happening even then was that there was a separation between those who had business degrees and engineering degrees and those who had degrees in fields that didn't directly translate into jobs. And so what started happening was people who had degrees in liberal arts were finding themselves jobless, finding themselves in situations where it was harder to find work. And that problem has only increased as the years have gone by.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And when you look at theological education, here's some interesting statistics. 10 years after a person graduates with a Master's of Divinity, 50% of those who got that degree are out of the business. They're no longer in Christian ministry. And that's of those who actually go into Christian ministry, because not everybody who gets the degree goes into Christian ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. Yeah.
Okay.
I want to explore that. You said 50% are no longer?
50% within 10 years.
Yeah, 10 years after.
10 years after. Can you go into that a little bit more as to why, possibly why, or?
So the year I started seminary was 1995. And I walked into the library at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I'm a book person. And I'm walking around the library, and I'm in the periodical section, and I see this Review of Religious Research journal, and this was I think it was spring 1995, and the issue there was an article there that attracted my attention, and the name of it was the Southern Baptist Convention: A Quiet Transformation. And one of the things that it was showing was that as people get more and more education from our seminaries and schools in general, the less orthodox they became. In fact, what it showed was the average person who got a diploma from a seminary, 95% of them believed in miracles, believed in biblical inerrancy, and that sort of thing. But when they got the Masters of Divinity, that number dropped into the 70 percentiles. And when it got to the PhD level, only 44% held to orthodoxy. So in other words, the more education they got, well, the more liberal they got.
That's interesting.
So one of the things that this article also pointed out was that when you look at pastors who were being fired, the majority of them were seminary grads. And I think that was because, for one thing, they were saying that the average pastor with a seminary degree was only staying at a church for 2 years. And I know that number has declined to a year and a half in some cases. But in any case, it just made it easier to fire them because they were so out of touch with the people in the pews. And so while seminary may have done something to educate them on the one hand, it also made them less committed to staying at a local congregation. And if they weren't interested in actually getting in touch with the congregation, it just made it that much easier for them to fire them.
Wow, that's interesting. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more, but I know we got to move on. But I have a few other questions too on something you had asked earlier as far as the protests, but we can revisit that if we have more time. So, Dr. Mitchell, we're aware of the decline in the U.S. What about other regions of the world?
So, here's the interesting thing. When you look at Europe, the gospel had been there for years, and now it's clearly in decline. And so, as a result, so is theological education. But when you look at other places in the world, places like South America, places like Africa, places like parts of Asia, it's growing there.
So not just
Christianity is growing, and as a result, so is theological education.
Okay. And yes, I wanted to take the conversation there. There is a connection between the growth and or decline of the church and the growth and or decline of theological education.
Absolutely.
Okay. Critique this thought. And this is a thought that as we were preparing for this episode and reflecting on this topic, what do you... Well, let me state the thought, and please critique it. Disagree with it, critique it however you desire. As far as when I look at church history, it appears to me that the church institution took the larger responsibility for theological education in the early church. Now, seminaries did, rise later. For example, Martin Luther taught at Wittenberg. Many, theologians that we study today from the 16th century and that era, many of them were professors at schools. Right. There had been a shift to the academy taking the responsibility for theological training. Are we witnessing a shift back to the church taking the larger responsibility for theological training again, as it was in the early church? So, the early church took more responsibility for theological training. There were several centuries where the academy took the larger responsibility, and now maybe we're seeing a shift back to the church taking that larger responsibility. And as I was reflecting on this topic, that's the thought that came to mind. So would you do me a favor and critique that thought?
Absolutely. The interesting thing is when you look at all the way up through the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, what you had was, teaching was done in the church. And then one of the things that happened was the formation of colleges. And really the first major school was the University of Paris, which today is known as the Sorbonne. And one of the things that happened there was you started having a number of colleges within the University of Paris. One was for the one was for the one was for the Dominicans, another for the Franciscans, and what happened was, Thomas Aquinas was the standout person among the Dominicans, and Bonaventure was one of the standout figures among the Franciscans. And eventually, what happened was when the Protestant Reformation happened, then something else started to happen. The Lutheran churches and whatever, they did start their own schools. But one of the other things that also happened was, for a long time, to teach at a university, you had to be a minister of some sort. And that really only started to change in the 1700s. And for a long time in the university system, it was believed that theology was the queen of the sciences. So everything was taught through the lens of theology. And I would dare say that once that thing shifted away from that, that's the beginning of a number of problems. And so where Protestants were concerned, they started building more and more. They started building their own colleges, and eventually standalone seminaries. And in the case of the Southern Baptists, what you had was the largest of those seminaries. Now, things are clearly going the other direction. Things are clearly in decline, and what I would imagine is that, yes, we are looking at a period in which a lot of theological education is going to go back to, maybe not to an individual local church, but maybe to an association of churches.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Because most local congregations don't have the ability to do it all by themselves. So what they would do is they would get together with other churches in a given area, and as a result, together teach theological education.
Okay. And to further my thinking on that, trying to figure out maybe possible reasons why the academy took so much responsibility for that theological training. I thought about the discoveries, the archaeological discoveries that were made in relatively recent, human history, like for example, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the early 1800s, and you had all of these sites in the Holy Land being discovered, and all of these discoveries, they helped to advance theological research and inquiry and biblical inquiry and research. Now, here's the connection that I made, that what if that was a necessity because in the course of history, because those discoveries, churches did not have the resources to make such contributions. I believe that most of those discoveries, they were made, or they were headed by not church institutions or ecclesiastical institutions, rather academic organizations and institutions.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. So, but now we're living, in the 21st century, where one could argue there's not a lot more discoveries that could be made, archaeological discoveries, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. What if, and of course, I'm trying to get into the mind of God now. What if God, who orchestrates history, what if God allowed there to be that shift to the academy for several centuries, so that those discoveries could be made? And now that information is there, now that the modern church has access to that data and that research, now it's time to move back to the church. And then I also thought about it eschatologically. When you look at the book of Revelation, you don't see an academy. You see just the church. There's not an academy that is being persecuted by the beast, but you see the church. And maybe it's God's plan that things shift away from the academy back to the church in the last days. And I know that's a whole lot, and there's probably a lot to critique there, but what are your thoughts on that as well?
Boy, you give me so much to riff off of.
Okay.
But so I'll say this, okay? Even if the Theological Academy wasn't there, the nation of Israel would have done a lot of the research. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls were something that was essential to their history, okay? And in Israel today, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there is a Dead Sea Scroll museum. And that would be in place regardless of whether there was a theological academy or not. Because the Jews trying to recapture their history, that's some pretty important stuff. And in fact, some of the digs that are still going on in Israel today are still funded by the Israeli government. And that's a good thing. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, I think, in the 1950s, 1960s, and by that time you had some evangelical seminaries, but you also had you also had the Roman Catholic Church, which was also doing a lot of this research, and so there's still so much that they're finding out, and still so much they're trying to nail down. And sadly, the field of biblical archaeology, it's fallen on some hard times. It used to be that it was a big deal at a lot of the Ivy League schools, at Harvard and Yale. University of Arizona used to be really big into it. And now all of those programs have died. While I was at Southwestern, our president, Paige Patterson, was trying to get a program there, and it lasted for a few years, and they were able to do some things, but the nature of the enterprise, it's expensive. And so right now, there are no seminaries, and as far as I know, there are no universities that are actually specializing in biblical archaeology.
Yeah.
So, the rate of discovery, the rate of information to be gained from that source of knowledge, that's definitely going to be on the decline. Right. Now, one of the other things that also has to be said is that the average pastor is not going to be reading this stuff. The average seminarian simply wasn't really interested in that kind of stuff. And this is one of the problems with theological education in general. Over the last 30 years, there's been a number of studies, and what they have found is that the average seminarian is not interested in theology.
That's an interesting statement.
I think that has had an impact.
Wow.
On the church. And I think that one of the things that one of the impacts of that is it's changed the nature of a lot of churches into just country clubs. One of the things that I did when I went through the PhD program at Southwestern, I wanted to learn as much as I could. So I did enough to major in ethics, enough to major in philosophy, enough to major in theology, enough to major in biblical studies. And, the average seminarian, even at the PhD level, doesn't do that. And one of the things that I find today, because I'm not a full-time academic anymore, but I am serving in a church, and the thing that I find is that the people at my congregation, they love the fact that I could just teach them in depth about the Word of God. And
that he can.
And I think that this is essential for every church. Pastors need to learn as much as they can about the Word of God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one of the things I used to tell my students is that they have a responsibility to learn as much as they could, because the people in their congregations rightfully have an expectation that they will be able to answer their questions. Mm-hmm. Because you are the seminary trained expert, and they're not.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, we talked about there's obviously a need for churches to step up.
Yes.
Now, we need theologically trained people.
Absolutely.
And the question is, who's going to do that? And of course, I think both institutions are needed for that, the church and the academy. Now, is there a silver lining to be found in the decline of theological education? Going back to my previous thought about if the seminaries are declining, it gives the church an opportunity to step back into that role, or at least more prominently. Do you feel that the formal theological training or education, is that something that we should try to revamp, or should we let it die out? Kind of like, just as an example, revivalism as a method of evangelism. You could argue that was a very successful method back in the 17th, 18th, and 19th, even early 20th century. But it is a method that has died out, and instead of trying to revive revivals, just let it die out and be replaced with something more effective for the time. Same concept for theological education. We see that it's declining. We see that it's dying out. Is it something that we should try to revamp, or should we allow that form of theological training to die out so that something that's more effective for today's time can take its place?
I'd like to add something.
I think that is a great question, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to over the years. When I came to Southwestern, I came with 2 bachelor's degrees and 2 master's degrees, primarily in engineering. And when I came to Southwestern and I saw the Master's of Divinity, that was 90 hours for a master's degree, and I'm thinking, something ain't right about that.
Yes.
That's too many hours.
Way too many.
And most master's degrees are 36-hour degrees. And I thought, and one of the things I saw as both a seminary student and as a seminary professor, because the degree takes so long to get, people who were called by God or might have been called by God, by the time they graduate, they've lost the fire. I mean, we seminaries need to get back to giving people what they need and then getting them out the door. I only got to preach once at chapel at Southwestern, and back then, being able to preach at chapel was a big deal because you have literally thousands of people. But one of the questions I ask people is, hey, did somebody shut hell up? Is hell still open? Because if it is, then we need to get about the business of evangelizing. We need to get back into the business of discipling. And here's one of the problems I saw as a professor. I would always ask my students, so what do you intend to do when you graduate? And all too often, here was the response. Well, I think I want to get a PhD. And then I'd ask, well, what do you want to do when you get that PhD? I want to teach. And so I would then ask, well, where do you want to teach? And the typical answer was, here at Southwestern.
Yes, and
here's what the vast majority of them had no interest in doing. And that was serving in a local congregation as a pastor.
Wow.
And see, what that says to me is that either seminary puts the wrong values into people, or seminary attracts the wrong kind of people.
Wow. That's good.
Okay.
And what we need is people who are called to serve in the local church. And theological education serves a purpose, and that purpose is to serve the church, not the academy.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I saw as a professor was most professors write books for other professors or for students. You know who we leave out? The church. The person in the pew. Adam Smith, who wrote the book The Wealth of Nations, what a lot of people don't realize is he had a chapter in the original version of that, and you can find it on, you can Google it and find it online. But he talks about religion, the economics of religion. And one of the things that he notes is those who are in ministry who don't want a pastor, you know what they do? They keep pursuing degrees. Why? Because they want power. They want prestige. They want connections.
That's interesting.
You know, the Lord wants some to be pastors.
Yes,
not
sir.
necessarily professors.
Yes, sir. For a minute there, Doc, I thought you were going to say they start podcasts. But since you're in that area, you're in the area where I had a question earlier. And I think, do we have time to... Are we...
Yeah.
We got time for one more, or do I... Two more or one more? All right, Doc. And you can hit on this because you're in that area where he was asking based on that silver lining question. You mentioned something earlier about seminarians are not interested in theological education, and you kind of touched on that based on what you just said. Can you give me some depth on that? If that's not their focus, then what are they doing? Does it make what are they doing there?
So here, I remember when I was a seminary student at Southwestern, living in the men's dorm, and I'll never forget one thing that one of the guys said to me. He says, you know, for a lot of people, seminary is like the French Foreign Legion. He says, you go in there and you hide out from the world for a number of years, and then you get your degree, and then you start a new life. And you know, I think a lot of people go to seminary not really knowing what they want to do.
Wow. That's interesting.
And you know, I was always influenced by my grandmothers. My grandmothers knew the Word of God, and they knew the God of that Word. And they read His Word, and they tried to learn as much as they could, and they tried to live by it. And there's a lot of people like my grandmothers. And sadly, there are not as many pastors as need to be who are concerned about teaching those women, helping those kind of people to grow in their faith.
Okay.
Well said.
Well, Dr. Mitchell, this has been an outstanding conversation. To our audience, go ahead. To our audience, we want our guest is the author of many written works. One that we want to promote on our show is called The Epic Bible Story, which is written, like he just mentioned, it is written with the layperson in mind. Not the seminarian, not the professor. Written by Craig Mitchell and Eric Mitchell, who are not related, by the way. Right. Dr. Mitchell tells us.
Right.
But to our guests, thank you. To our audience, thank you. We don't do this every episode, but every once in a while we want to share thank yous to those who watch us around the world. Thank you to the Fishbowl studio who provides us with analytics. Last week for our episode 8, we had well over 4,000 people to view or listen during this time. 3,200 from the United States, 1,000 from the United Kingdom, and so many others from about 35 other countries. So to those who watch and listen all over the world, we want to say thank you to our growing audience. And then we always want to say thank you to our donors and our partners and sponsors, the Dallas Bible Theological Institute, the Urban Christian Writers Guild, the West Mount Moriah Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas, as well as the Bread of Life Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you so much for to everybody who has a part in making this podcast what it is. Again, to our guest, Dr. Mitchell, thank you for being on with us today. And until next week, God's blessings upon you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.